Hello everyone. Welcome to the video presentation of my action research, fostering students' engagement in non-graded online handout completion with the use of the self-determination theory. My name is Melanie Ojeda. I'm a pre-service teacher, and in this video I will explain how I developed a pedagogical intervention in an attempt to foster my students' learning. The structure of this video has 5 main parts. First, I will provide a description of the context and my group of learners. Then, I will explain the online teaching modality of my school and my students' learning behavior. Moving forward, I'm going to introduce the literature review I drew on for developing the action plan, and I will explain the action plan in detail. By the end of the video, I will provide a final reflection of the learning gains of doing action research. So, for understanding my context, it's important to mention 2 things. First, students' lack of motivation to learn English in the Chilean context, and second, the adoption of distant learning due to the COVID-19 pandemic situation. This current situation has left in evidence the need of further researching motivation in the online learning environment, as much of the existing research on motivation has been directed towards developing strategies only inside the physical classroom. In an attempt to cope with the already mentioned research gap, I conducted an investigation project on online learners' motivation at the school where I'm currently doing my practicum. Here I'm in charge of teaching a very homogeneous group of students, a 12th grade class composed of 28 students from 16 to 18 years old. They all have more or less the same A2 proficiency level, and in terms of the learning difficulties, they usually have problems with the writing skill. Going into the online teaching modality of my school, we are working with an asynchronous online teaching modality through a platform called Google Classroom, which is the screenshot that you can see here. The policy for these online classes consists of an upload of material every 2 weeks, where students are expected to download the material and send it back once completed. When I started teaching at the target school, I conducted an interview with the mentor teacher in an attempt to understand my students' learning behavior. And what really caught my attention was that, as it can be seen here, under normal circumstances, the students respond only to rewards and punishments. After observing my students' behavior in online classes, I realized that they were behaving in the exact same way, responding only to handouts that were graded, as it can be seen in this Google Classroom analysis. Moreover, I carried out a survey in an attempt to understand my students' motivation to solve the handouts, which revealed that 57% of the students had been completing their handouts driven only by their desire to avoid a failing grade. With all the data I could gather, I realized that my students were relying too heavily on extrinsic motivators, which led me to the question, how can I intrinsically motivate my students to participate in non-graded online assignments? In an attempt to answer this question, I created an action plan based on the constructs of motivation and the self-determination theory. For the effects of this project, we will understand motivation as proposed by Gardner, who states that motivation is the combination of effort plus desire to achieve the goal of learning a language. Accordingly, motivation is also widely accepted to have 2 different sources. Desi and Ryan posit that motivation can come from the inside of learners or the outside of learning, and depending on the source, the effect of their learning process will be affected differently. Following the definition in this table, a concrete example of intrinsic motivation to learn English will be the desire that a particular student could have for personal development. Alternatively, a concrete example of extrinsic motivation would be my student's situation of engaging only in graded activities. After understanding these 2 concepts, I wondered whether there was the most beneficial type of motivation when dealing with auto-learning, and according to Ligot, the answer is yes. In fact, she argues that although extrinsic motivators are thought to be helpful to promote action, they are also very negative over the learner's autonomy and authentic learning. For dealing with intrinsic motivation, Desi and Ryan proposed the self-determination theory, which states that learning is driven by 3 innate psychological needs, namely autonomy, competence, and relatedness, and that when these 3 psychological needs are satisfied in the learning experience, intrinsic motivation to face such experience is very likely to increase. I'll give you a couple of seconds to read the definitions before moving forward. When taking this theory into action, Linus, 2013, argued that it's important that teachers take concrete actions with the aim of fulfilling the 3 psychological needs in students. For example, they argue that for boosting competence, teachers are to encourage students' personal growth and promote critical thinking in challenging activities in terms of the language, among others. It is also important to mention that Wu, 2003, argues that each psychological need has a different impact over the student's learning, depending on the classroom environment. This hypothesis is key for understanding my action plan. Moving forward, my action plan, it was designed drawing from the above literature, and it consists on incorporating 2 concrete STD-based actions per psychological need into the English handouts. As you can see here, following the rationale of Wu, 2003, each psychological need has been separated into different days in order to find out if any of them has a bigger influence over the student's participation than the others. Some important information to consider about the intervention is that it was organized around Unit 1 for 12th graders. The learning objectives respond to the ones stated in the school planning. Its time frame consists of 6 weeks, and its application consists of 1 handout every 2 weeks, hence a total of 3 non-graded handouts, 1 handout per psychological need. The first handout is aimed at boosting a student's relatedness by developing the reading and writing skill through pair and group activity. As you can see here, the handout starts with a viewing warm-up activity that prompts students' exchange of ideas via social media. After that, students are to answer a couple of comprehension questions in a already existing Facebook group. By the end of the handout, students are to answer questions aimed at acknowledging and validating their feelings in order to create a sense of online community. Handout number 2 is aimed at boosting a student's competence by developing the writing skill. This handout deals with writing as it has been identified to be the most challenging skill for my students. Here, students are to engage in an Instagram post where they are to write their thoughts and ideas freely, but following some requirements in order to make the activity challenging enough. For example, using vocabulary of the unit, using some grammar structures, etc. For handout number 3 is aimed at boosting students' autonomy, which will be aimed by providing students with many options in terms of video and questions as proposed by the literature. For assessing this intervention, I developed this questionnaire that was implemented before the intervention. Nonetheless, as participation was voluntary, only 3 students completed the questionnaire, which prevented me from gathering representative data. In spite of this, at the end of the intervention, it is expected that a major percentage of students will engage in a second instance of answering this questionnaire. Finally, I will carry out the same classroom platform analysis I did at the beginning of the semester in order to establish if participation in non-graded assignments actually increased. As my final reflection, I would like to point out 2 ideas. First, using classroom research as a useful tool to find a possible solution to my students' more pressing learning issues and to adapt my teaching considering the constraints or the limitation of my context. and the immense value I have found in doing research classroom for understanding myself as an effective teacher and for being conscious about my teaching philosophy and beliefs. Above all, I consider motivation to be key in L2 learning success, which obviously led me to developing this action plan. As a final conclusion to this entire process, I'm convinced that being a teacher is a constant process of learning by trial and error, and being conscious about this will lead me to structure my teaching around my students' needs and to develop new methods to always enhance their learning. Here you'll find the bibliography used for the literature review. Thank you for watching the video.